First, let me thank George, John, and Francisco for inviting me. This has been a wonderful conference, and let me thank you all as well for staying for the last talk. So, not only am I the last speaker, but I am a bit of an outlier amongst the speakers that we've heard so far, because I believe I'm the only person that doesn't study the brain directly. I study the brain indirectly by looking at cognition and behavior. So I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. My primary interest is in human evolution, and my specialty within evolutionary anthropology is evolutionary psychology. I'm interested in the evolution of human cognition, and I use cross-cultural studies of cognition and development to try to triangulate universals and variants in human behavior and cognition. What I want to talk to you about today is to give you a report from the social sciences to the brain sciences. And I want to discuss with you what I think is a major problem in the social sciences in thinking about brain specialization that I think is actually hindering the ability of social science research to speak effectively to the brain sciences. And I'll start by describing what I think, or at least what I think part of the problem is. I'll give you some empirical examples, very briefly from my own work and that of colleagues, which illustrate illustrate a few things about the mismatch between the problem and the kinds of data that we're going to need to explain. And then I'll move to the meat of the talk, which is what I think the elements of a solution are going to have to be. And then I'll return to the issue of what confronts us about humans, what confronts us about human evolution and human cognition that we're going to need to explain, and try to show you how I think some of these theoretical ingredients can be applied to that problem. And by the way, I think that many of these ingredients have already been presented in the talks that we've heard over the last couple days. So hopefully this will resonate with lots of the things that we've heard so far. Finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about future research on the evolution of cognitive specializations in humans. So what's the problem that I'm talking about? And I'm going to illustrate this by presenting two poles, two diametric opposites, which are present in the social science literature in thinking about the evolution of human cognitive specializations. And so the first comes from evolutionary psychology, my own field. And the view from evolutionary psychology, of course, there's variation amongst evolutionary psychologists, but you can summarize the central view as Cosmides and Tooby do here. The mind is a set of information processing machines, and I've inserted the term adaptations here, that were designed by natural selection to solve adaptive problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And you might also bracket the term hunter-gatherer ancestors here because many evolutionary psychologists, at least I do, think that the adaptations that we see in the mind are a mix of ancient and more recently derived adaptations, and that's actually going to form one of the main parts of my talk. So this view is sometimes called massive modularity, a term coined by my colleague Dan Sperber. I'm not a huge fan of the term massive modularity because of what the word massive evokes, but I'm fine with the term multi-modularity as long as there's more than one. That's the view that I would take. Now, you're probably familiar with some of the criticisms of evolutionary psychology. Someone who's broadly considered to be the person who introduced the idea of modularity into psychology, at least, Jerry Fodor, has called this view modularity theory gone mad. And philosopher David Buller, a philosopher of biology, has called evolutionary psychology, quote, wrong in almost every detail. So, not really pulling any punches there. So the other side of the coin, right, and I'm presenting these as sort of diametric opposites. I'm taking a dialectical position here. The opposite side are what you might call extreme domain general accounts. So I've picked, for example, Quartz and Sinowski in their Behavior and Brain Sciences paper in 1997, who say the developing cerebral cortex is largely free of domain-specific structure. That can, of course, be interpreted in a variety of ways. A clearer statement of this position is from David Buller again, who says, with the possible exception of our sensory transducers, okay, so cochlea, retinas, it's not the contingently stable brain structures in an adult's brain that are adaptations. Rather, the brain's very developmental plasticity is the adaptation. So that's a pretty extreme view in the opposite direction. And I'd like to pause for a second to just get you to think about the wide gap between those views. Imagine if you saw that kind of difference of opinion in another area of science like chemistry or physics, right? Where one side says, matter is made of atoms, and the other side says, no, it isn't. When I think about this, I like to say, good luck getting your car started in the morning if you lived in a world like this, much less building a rocket that can land on the moon. It's a major problem that we can't, that there's this much difference of opinion in experts on a field looking at the same phenomena and coming to these radically different conclusions. And so that's the problem, at least in the social sciences. I detect that it's not as much of a problem in the brain sciences, but I'll report to you as an ethnographer from social science that it's a humongous problem in the social sciences and one that we need to resolve. Okay, so getting towards a solution. What I think is a useful thing to do here is to try to separate the signal from the noise in this debate. And what I've put up here are some statements that I think are quite reasonable, and I hope that you'll agree with me on. The first is that functionally organized cognition and behavior are likely to be the result of adaptations. So me talking right now and you understanding what I'm saying, there's probably adaptations involved there. I think we can agree on that. And then the question is, what are they? The second thing is for complex organisms with complex brains like us, there are likely to be multiple adaptations involved, even, I dare say, perhaps, in the cortex. And we've seen some examples, actually, of research that suggests that there are indeed likely to be adaptations, even in the cortex. But it's an empirical question, and our job is to find out what they are. And my point is that this theoretical impasse is to some degree preventing us from really getting down to the business of finding out what they are, because the models that we have of what brain specializations might be in the social sciences are not very biologically realistic. So my proposed solution, I think, is fairly reasonable, which is to look to evolutionary theory, developmental evolutionary biology, research on the brain, to develop more biologically realistic views of what brain adaptations might be like, and to couple this with more openness to discovering them. This is a view that my colleague Rob Kurzman and I proposed in this paper in Psych Review in 2006, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of the latest version of that kind of proposal. So I mentioned Jerry Fodor, and I think that a major part of the problem comes from biologically unrealistic models of brain adaptations. Now, I'm going to lump a little of this on Fodor, but I actually think that this is more deeply entrenched than this. This dates way back. It maybe even dates into sort of intuitions that we have about what mechanistic stuff is like, right? So it predates the 1983 book by Fodor and comes from ancient nature-nurture types of things. But so Fodor, when in my day job, when I say I study psychological specializations, people say, oh, you mean modules? And I say, okay, yeah, sure, modules. And then they say, well, so you mean Fodorian modules? So that's what most psychologists think when you say this. And Fodor presented, I think, 9 characteristics that he thought might be typical of modules. At the time, he was quite careful to say he didn't think that those were all necessarily always true of modules, but somehow that's seeped in so that now everybody just thinks that these are things that must be true of modules. One of them is this idea of domain narrowness, processing only pre-specified and narrow content. Automaticity, meaning that they're not modulated by other systems or consciousness. No horizontal or top-down modulation, right? As neuroscientists, you probably think that that's probably not a particularly common feature of neural systems, that they don't receive inputs from anywhere else except from bottom up, but it's an empirical question again. And then this idea that they're rigid and inflexible, that they process stimuli when they get it and can't be modulated in any way by context, for example. And then finally, a sort of very simplistic idea of innateness, that they develop the same way regardless of experience, meaning that in order to be a module, you have to develop exactly the same way, cookie-cutter-like, in every single person on Earth. And if you don't, then you're not a module, and you're not an adaptation. And so I think already you can see, from a biological point of view, are those properties, are those synonymous with what a biologist would call an adaptation? No, not at all. And let me give you a few examples that I think show empirical phenomena that can't be easily accommodated. So they certainly involve adaptations. They seem very likely to involve adaptations, but we're going to have to expand our view of what's going on to explain these things. All of them are, we might think of as adaptations for learning. So very briefly, an example of my own work. I mentioned I do cross-cultural comparisons. My field site is in the Amazon basin of Ecuador. I work with the Shuar, a native Amazonian group. And this was a study comparing Shuar kids, an opportunity sample from a village of kids 4 to 11, comparing them with preschoolers, kindergartners, age 4 to 6 in Los Angeles. So these are city-dwelling LA kids. And this was a memory study. What we did was, it's very simple. We use flashcards. We have 2 groups. We have an experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group, we basically take these cards. We say to the kid, OK, I'm going to show you some animals you probably haven't seen before. We've pre-tested them to know that the kids don't know this. Neither Shuar nor American kids tend to know these animals. And we say, I'm going to tell you some things about these, and then later on, I'm going to shuffle the cards and ask you what you remember. Then we tell them, counterbalance for order, we tell them the name of the animal. We tell them the diet, whether it eats plants and animals, and we tell them whether it's safe or dangerous. And then, like I said, we shuffle the cards, and then I say, OK, let's see what you remember. Here's this animal. What's it called? What does it eat? Is it safe or dangerous? And so that's an immediate test. And then we come back a week later and do the exact same thing, importantly, without any feedback. So at this point, we don't tell them whether they were right or not. And we have a control group, and the purpose of that is to make sure that any effects that we see here are because of the training and not because of things that children might know or infer from the pictures without any training. So in the control group, we just ask them these questions without any training. And what you see is, if you compare the control and the test, on these binary judgments, remember 50% would be you don't know the answer, you're guessing. And what you see is that the training has a significant effect for the danger information. So after a single exposure, they jump to well above chance for the danger information, but not for the other information. We've actually done a bunch of versions of this, and we're now expanding it beyond animals to artifacts and foods. But you see this prepared danger learning effect, and you see it in the Americans and the Shuar. Overall, the Shuar are a little bit better because the sample includes older kids, but the effect size is the same at a given age for American and Shuar kids. Interesting because Shuar kids face real danger of being harmed by dangerous animals, and kids living in LA generally don't, but you see the same learning effect. I'll come back to what I think this says. Here's another study from my colleague George Gergely. He used a paradigm originally developed by Andy Meltzoff for studying imitation, a light box, and this is a box that has a button on the top that lights up when you press it. This is a study with infants, 14-month infants, and so what Meltzoff had originally found is that if an adult demonstrator takes this box, leans forward and presses it with her forehead, turning on the light, and then pushes the box over to a baby, the baby will also lean over and with its forehead turn on the light. Most babies will, not all babies. So George had this great idea to look at context here. So he had one condition where the person says, "Brr, I'm really cold," wraps themselves in a blanket or a shawl, and then bends over and turns on the light with their forehead. In the other condition, the person says, "Brr, I'm really cold," wraps himself in the shawl, but keeps their hands on the table and does the exact same thing. Okay, and what I think about here, the analogy might be, let's say that you're looking at, you're waiting for the elevator, and somebody comes up and they're holding a bunch of folders, and they reach up with their knee to press the button, the down button on the elevator, right? If you observe that, would you from then on out think that you ought to press the elevator button with your knee? What you see is that these babies, these 14-month-old babies, when the hands are occupied, they actually use their hands. Okay, so in this condition, in essence, they make the inference, well, yeah, the person is turning on this thing with their head, but I'm just going to use my hands, right? Whereas here, they seem to make the inference that if their hands were free and they're using their forehead, there must be some reason why they're using their forehead. That's what you do to turn this thing on. Okay? George has done and his colleagues have done a whole bunch of follow-ups of this. You can look it up to try to nail down what the effect is. But the point is that the imitation here is inferential. It's not just blind copying. Final study that I want to mention. So this is a study by Kylie Hamlin and colleagues, again using very young babies. And what they show is they're actually sort of, they're not actually animations. They have little sort of puppet stages that they do this stuff with. And in this condition, what you see is this ball with it's actually a little Pac-Man-like thing with eyes, with googly eyes. And what the child sees is it makes several attempts to go up the hill. Now, I'm using the word attempt. If I were to show you a video of this, you would actually perceive it the same way, that this thing was trying to get up the hill 3 times and not making it. But in the stimulus, really, there's no attempt. It's just we interpret it that way, and so do the babies. And in this condition, it's a helping condition, so this triangle comes out. After the guy's made 3 tries to get up and doesn't make it, the triangle comes out and helpfully pushes him up the hill and helps him over. In this condition, the Pac-Man guy tries 3 times, but now the mean blue square comes over the hill and impedes him and pushes him down. Okay, so that's one condition, and then there's also this inanimate condition where there's no eyes, and it's kind of a ball. Amazing results here. This was in Nature. You can find it a few years back. And if you're familiar with infant research, these effect sizes are absolutely incredible. So these are 6- and 10-month-old kids. And what you see, the DV is interesting. After this, there's a little tray that pops out, and the baby can actually reach out and take one of the 2 objects. They're physically there. And the babies overwhelmingly like to take the helper. And so there's different ways of interpreting this. There's now been a lot of follow-up work. But as a first pass, there seems to be some evaluation going on of these little characters by these very young babies. So what's going on here? However you want to call it, there's definitely learning involved. These things are facilitating learning, right? The baby, by observing these displays, they don't have a pre-existing concept that triangles are good or blue squares are evil, right? They're using the stimulus to learn. It's flexible. So in my studies, they're learning from propositional statements. We actually think this is a homologous trait because this was inspired by research by Susan Meinecke and colleagues on rhesus macaques, where there's social learning of fear. But in those cases, it's observing a scared face of a conspecific. Here, we're just telling them, hey, this thing is dangerous. There's actually there's not much emotional valence, but you get the prepared learning effect. In George's study, it's blankets. There's no evolutionary preparation for understanding the role of blankets in constraining hands. And little Pac-Man on ramps, right? So these things are flexible. I think that the Gerges study, the Lightbox study, shows that it's not automatic because the child's imitation varies quite a bit depending on the context, suggesting interaction with some sort of reasoning process on the part of the child. And I think that we could argue about what it is, but it's something like making inferences about the goals of the other person. And in all these cases, I think, well, at least in some of them, older and newer mechanisms seem to interact. So the danger learning probably there are homologies in other animals for prepared learning about danger, but getting it via propositional transmission is probably something only humans can do. So some kind of link up between language and these older mechanisms. Okay, and I'll return to the issue at the end. I'm not going to go through all of this, but clearly big brains is part of it, a big part of it. I mean, from a certain perspective, all of it, right? But what's in those big brains? And a point here is that learning is inferential. So you expose primates, even quite smart primates, and humans to the same kind of stimuli. And the inferences that humans make, even babies, seem to be quite different. My colleague Susan Perry at UCLA studies cultural transmission in capuchins. They're very smart. There's been question about whether you ought to use things like excephalization quotient or not, whether you ought to use ratios. If you do, you find these guys have got one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest encephalization quotient in primates other than people. And they do social transmission, but when a human sees this nut cracking, they go, okay, this guy's trying to crack this nut with a rock. I'm going to try it myself, right? On the first try, humans infer that. These monkeys look like they go, well, there's food involved, there's somehow a rock involved, and there's a nut involved, so I'm going to try a bunch of stuff. And it takes them 7 or 8 years to become experts at this. So there's inferential capacities about inferring the goals of others that seem quite different. Now, how do we theorize this? So here's the ingredients that I think we're going to need to explain this kind of stuff. We're going to need natural selection, and we're going to need a biologically appropriate view of natural selection as acting on variation that's there, so descent with modification. We're going to need a view of whatever brain specializations are, not sort of cookie-cutter things that get taken out of the box and just switched on, right? But we're going to need an evolutionary development type of view of modules that involves developmental processes. I'm going to talk about these as module spawning processes, and reaction norms, so flexible responses to developmental conditions. We're going to need homology, and the idea, this resonates with Todd's talk earlier, of reuse of building blocks, thrifty evolution, reusing what's already there with some modifications. And an important thing that we're going to need is to think about nonlinear evolution, because there's going to be feedback effects, especially with cultural beings like us. We get these bigger brains, we change the world, we make stuff in the world, and that changes selection on those brains, and that, over evolutionary time, can have major nonlinear effects on the course of evolution. I'm going to use little diagrams that are similar to the ones that Leah used in her talk, where I'm using gray squares to mean brains, and then we can think about this as some kind of a process or cognitive trait, and it gets modified over time. So this is just descent with modification. And by feedback, I just mean that changes here might affect selection pressures there. Now, by reaction norms, this up here would be a typical thing that you would see in a textbook, a description of a reaction norm. In biology, you take a genotype, you put it into different environments, and you get different phenotypic outcomes. Okay, there's some sort of a mapping. The Fodorian view of innateness is what you would call a flat reaction norm, where no matter what you do, you get the same phenotypic outcome. But we know there's plenty of adaptations. In fact, probably the majority of adaptations show something more like this. You get different outcomes depending on the environment. In order to think about humans, things like culture and language, I think we're also going to need to think about this kind of thing as a reaction norm. This sometimes startles people, but I think I would call this a reaction norm of humans. This is a map, of language groups in the Northeast Amazon. And so you take a typical human, pick basically any genotype you want, drop them into this range of environments, and these are the outcomes that you'll see. If you grow up here, you speak this language. If you grow up there, you speak that language. Here's another one. This is the electoral results of the national election of 2004 in California. Green counties voted for Kerry, red counties voted for Bush. A lot of people don't like to think about this as part of human phenotypes. But my colleagues who study culture gene coevolution, people like Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, would say, in order to understand the evolution of things like social learning, we have to think about these kinds of things as parts of the human phenotype. If you grow up here, you end up voting for Kerry. If you grow up here, you end up voting for Bush. And humans have the capacity to acquire cultural norms, political norms, and so on. The important point here is that if I show these to my colleagues, typically they say, okay, well, then you're not looking at adaptations here, because the outcomes are all different here, and the outcomes are all different here. So if you see variation, clearly you're not looking at adaptation. But to a biologist, it can clearly be the case that you see variable outcomes. But that doesn't mean that adaptations aren't involved in generating those things. Okay, module spawning. When am I over, by the way? Sorry. What time am I done? Okay, good. So what I mean here is the creation of modules during development. And I want to talk about a couple possibilities. Again, this actually relates nicely back to Leah Krubitzer's talk about how module varieties might be generated. And an important thing here is the idea that a very common idea in evolutionary developmental biology, that developmental processes are likely to be nested with more specific developmental processes nested within more general ones. So you see this frequently in things like tissue differentiation, where you first get broad differentiations, and then within those you get greater and greater degrees of specialization. And I want to think about a couple kinds of processes. One of them I'm calling type-specific processes, which I'll explain in a minute, and then token-specific processes, so variants within those computational types. And I also think that an important thing to think about is going to be what I'm calling here, for lack of a better terminology, closed versus open dimensions of reaction norms. So here, where this reaction norm has probably, plausibly been, the entire space has been explored by the evolutionary process, plausibly. Whereas here, evolution hasn't actually visited Kerry world or Bush world yet, right? They're novel in that sense, and yet we can still talk about these as reaction norms. It's what happens when you take a human and drop them into these political environments, but they're open in some ways. So what do I have in mind by these module spawning processes? Here's a few examples. So you can imagine initially equipotential tissue. Here I put it in quotes because I don't mean that this tissue could develop into anything. I just mean imagine an initial state where it could go in several ways, but it hasn't yet decided. Take a bit here, and let's magnify it. Type generating processes. Now, we can think here about that different regions and different cognitive specializations might have computational properties. So a good example is thinking to Lucy Jacobs' talk, where she talked about cognitive maps and that there are computational properties that have to be true in order to instantiate that kind of ability. So you need to have, say, landmarks and then some sort of directional information. In cognitive science, there's a whole bunch of other things. So you can imagine, for example, and I've sort of shorthanded these with functions, but I don't mean that to be taken literally. But for example, there's perhaps Bayesian computational designs. There's a lot of stuff now in cognitive science about Bayesian designs in cognition that they could happen in vision, they could happen in categorization, all kinds of areas. You could imagine things like, sort of traditional neural networks where they're essentially instantiating a regression, some sort of a weighted average of the inputs. You could imagine a computational design that's like a gate, highly nonlinear, like an AND gate or an OR gate, right? And so building blocks where, and an interesting question is, what are the events developmentally that causes tissue to develop into one of those computational types? Another kind of thing, which isn't mutually exclusive, but is what you might think of as a bifurcation process, where what causes what you might think of as a single module developmentally to turn into more than one. And I'll give you some examples of that in a second, right? Where you have a single functional unit that's getting input, and maybe there's two different kinds of information in that input. There could be developmental procedures that say, well, let's spawn two functional units. They might be anatomically distinct, or they could be anatomically overlapping, but functionally separate processes that spawn as a result of highly divergent inputs going to the same area. And then token generating processes, which I'll also give you an example of. So given that there's particular contents like faces or objects going to an area, processes that tune that area to become more and more specific to things like, say, faces or artifacts or other kinds of things. And we'll talk about the case of words. So here's the good news and the bad news about this is that we know that specialized processes can involve contingent procedures, including things like perhaps turning on or off of genes contingently based on what's happening in particular times and places in the brain. I mean, we know there's numerous examples from evolutionary developmental biology that show that there's a range of possibilities. The outcomes can be that there can be selection for general types, and then the environment makes the tokens alone. Or you can even have, as we saw in the case of things like limb differentiation, you can have limbs are a type in crustaceans, right? But you can have specific selection for a claw limb or selection for a swimming limb. And those are tokens. So you could have either one. And there's a problem empirically is that it's difficult to rule out specialization based on apparent equipotentiality of starting states and plasticity of outcomes. So the kind of thing that Quartz and Sinowski were saying, look, you look at the beginning, there's no domain specificity. Sure, you look at the end, there's domain specificity, but there can't be any specialization because it starts out equipotential. No, that doesn't work as a biological argument. That's not sufficient evidence to say that there's not specialized developmental procedures going on. It's a problem. It's a problem empirically for us. Face perception has been looked at quite a bit. Here's brain mapping study looking at kids to adults, these different sort of specialized object perception areas and how they develop over the life course. So you look at young kids and you don't really yet see full you don't see the development yet of this face area, the facial fusiform area. You see the parahippocampal place area is there early, and a more general object recognition areas, and you basically get specialization of these areas over developmental time. And here's a kind of scenario. This is the kind of thing that's been proposed by Mark Johnson and earlier by Annette Karmeloff-Smith. This is kind of what I mean by developmental spawning, is that you start out from this state where you're getting some kind of visual input. I've made these blurry because the developmental process itself can actually improve abilities to make these discriminations. So sort of undifferentiated state at the beginning of development, an object, maybe some kind of object-specific parsing abilities develop, and then as development continues, you're able to make finer and finer grained distinctions within these categories, and you start to get spawning of these specialized areas for things like places and faces, so that by adulthood you have what you might call domain-specific specialized areas for recognizing particular kinds of objects. Now, we're faced with this empirical problem. In the literature, this is sometimes called the expertise versus domain specificity debate about face recognition. Expertise people say, well, faces are they're just a token of there's only specialization for object recognition. Faces are just a token that we look at a lot. And so the parsimonious thing is to assume there's been no selection specifically for face recognition. And the domain specificity debate says, well, yeah, I mean, there's face recognition develops reliably in every normal person and in a lot of other primates. Good reason to think that there's been selection for it, but it's very hard to tell. There's good reason to think that these developmental processes are hierarchical, and then the question is, how do we empirically distinguish between these accounts? Okay, let's add homology in, and several people have proposed, I put up Gary Marcus, and several others have proposed that duplication and divergence processes may play a big role in evolution of new brain adaptations. You're probably all familiar with this kind of terminology. I've borrowed this terminology from Fitch, who developed it originally to talk about gene homologies, but I think that you can use the same, conceptually it extends to trait homologies as well. So varieties of homology, of course, homologies are traits that evolved from a common ancestor. Orthologs share their origin in the most recent common ancestor of two species. And then there's this idea of paralogs, which are homologs that evolve via duplication. And you can distinguish between in-paralogs and out-paralogs. All that means is, did the duplication occur prior to the last common ancestor of the species, or did it occur after the last common ancestor? So one of the questions we could ask is, are there in-paralogs, are there in-paralogous modules that have evolved in humans since the chimp-human common ancestor? When we think about face perception, so we might think of some very ancient ancestral state, and this is just conjectural, before perhaps the origin of separate face perception and place perception areas. These may have evolved through through sort of bifurcation, duplication of ancestral object perception processes, and were probably present in chimp-human common ancestor. In us, though, so we're going to have, these are going to be out-paralogs in us because they arose through duplication of these recognition areas well prior to the chimp-human common ancestor, but we may have other things like word perception areas. How do we think about those? You may be familiar with the work of Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues on word recognition in the brain, where there's evidence that there's a quote-unquote specialized area. There's an area that responds selectively to words. They've called it the visual word form area. And what's interesting is it responds selectively to words, not consonants, and it's got interesting properties like it's font independent. It doesn't matter the font that you show. It doesn't matter if you show upper or lower case. It responds to the word dog, whether the word dog is written in handwriting or in type. And it quite reliably develops in literate people. And they have a computational model that's quite typical for a computational model in psychology, where it involves building up features, pandemonium-style model. And what's interesting in this case is, this is work by Mark Changizi. I'll say I find it astonishing and maybe a little bit hard to believe. You go read the paper and judge for yourself. But what he's found is evidence that letters in human alphabets have evolved culturally to suit object recognition abilities in humans. And so what he does is he looks at the junctions in letters, and they actually, the ones that are common in human languages, match the kinds of junctions that you see in natural scenes. Things like the kinds of corners that you would see where a tree limb meets another tree limb. And he actually does this by analyzing natural scenes, the frequency of these kinds of junctions in natural scenes and the frequency of these in visual signs. And I mean, this is the correspondence that you see. Pretty remarkable. So the point here being, right, you also have cultural evolution on the other side of these objects. So how do we think about this? Well, I mean, you could think of this word perception area as perhaps an inparalogous module that's present in humans. And what's interesting is that it's not present in all humans. It's what happens when you take a brain that has these module spawning abilities and you put it into an environment with words, you reliably get this area developing in people. And so one possibility here is that what we're seeing is this kind of process may have happened when tools or something became, for example, tools became common in ancestral human environments. You might have seen a spawning process that generated some sort of tool area that initially was the result of a reaction norm, right? And that then selection began to act on that. And so what we might be seeing with this word area is kind of the intermediate stage of evolution, that something analogous to the intermediate stage of evolution that we might see, where if it becomes the case that everybody grows up in an environment with words, there can be selection to actually refine this area and give it more and more specialized properties. And I'm not even going to, so we've got to also apply this kind of analysis to higher level processes. There's interesting work on things like theory of mind, which I mentioned, that suggests brain regions involved, work by people like Rebecca Sachs, and this study by Gobini. That's going to have to be part of the picture too. So I'll just gesture at that without discussing it in detail. Now finally, let me return to humans, the human case, and the kind of stuff that we're going to have to confront. So both the ingredients that we can make use of, which are empirical facts about human evolution that might be relatively scarce, but making those match up with the kind of story that I'm presenting. So here's a very reduced list of facts that we know about events that have occurred since the chimp-human common ancestor. And let me point out that one of the things that's nice, or that's an advantage for us, and thinking back to many of the talks that we've heard today and yesterday, is that in the explanation of human cognitive abilities, as a starting state, we get this very nice ape brain, right? So as a starting point, we get all the stuff that was likely present in the chimp-human common ancestor, meaning that a lot of the work is already done because those are smart critters, and we can assume that those abilities were likely present in the chimp-human common ancestor. And in fact, what we see, Todd alluded to this in his talk, most of the things we see in humans, we see some version of them in chimps. They have some tool use. They have some hunting and some meat in their diet, right? Chimps hunt regularly. Not as much as humans by a long shot, but they do. They have some social learning and culture. They have some limited amount of cooperation, and they have some theory of mind. But so they have versions of these, but that are not nearly as elaborate as what we have. And then when we look at the evolutionary changes that have happened since the chimp-human common ancestor leading up to now, we know that bipedalism appeared early. This is Sahelanthropus chadensis. There's actually about 3 species of hominins from this very early period after the divergence of chimps. We actually aren't 100% sure that it's after the divergence of chimps, the chimp and human lineages. But we know indirectly from anatomical evidence that they were probably bipedal, things like the position of the foramen magnum. And by Australopithecines, we have evidence that there was substantially more meat eating in the diet. And we have interesting evidence from tooth eruption patterns that there was elongated child development already by this time. And we know that this is a biologically costly thing to delay reproduction. It's one of the most costly changes that you can do is to wait longer to reproduce. It has to be offset by some other benefit. And anthropologists generally think that that benefit probably included, well, whatever the benefits are of having a longer childhood, more time to learn, more time to be socialized, more time for cultural acquisition. I mean, probably there were some precursors to cultural learning here. You don't get the first brain size burst until the origin of our genus. This is Homo heidelbergensis about 1.8 million years ago. That's where you see about a doubling in brain volume. And you also see, around that time, increasingly complex foraging, meaning that there's scavenging and extracted food, so digging stuff out of the ground with tools that probably requires transmission of knowledge about how and where to get that stuff. And you start to see stone tools, simple stone tools, but ones that we already know, they require some planning, dexterity to create. And then from there you get accelerating cultural complexity up to the recent second brain size burst to our average brain volume of about 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. And in this time you see just this accelerating. And by accelerating, I mean it starts slow and keeps getting faster and faster. Cultural complexity. A good thing to read on this is McBroody and Brooks' review in 2000, where they look at over a couple 100,000 years, the last about 300,000 years accumulation of technological complexity in Africa that just keeps getting fancier and fancier and fancier. Now, what I've put here on the side is all these things which we can't really assign temporally to where they appeared, but probably somewhere in here and probably in a ratcheting or an accelerating kind of way. One of the things that's quite important is that we have ratcheting or cumulative cultural transmission. So chimps have cultural transmission, but the laptop that I'm using right now is substantially better than the laptop that I might have been using 5 years ago, which is substantially better than whatever I would have been using 5 years before that. If you look at chimps, sure, yeah, they learn from other chimps how to fish with a stick, but you don't get the stick evolving into an iPad, right? And it's true when you look at human technological change that it was quite slow off at the beginning and accelerated, but that's something we're going to have to explain. And all these other kinds of things as well. And this is where I think the story's going to have to involve interaction. So things like fine-grained manual dexterity, motor abilities that humans have, probably involves feedback, right? That we're creating these tools. It requires cultural transmission to create these tools, and that in turn exerts, basically creates a selective advantage for having finer and finer grained motor abilities. So not a single change, but multiple changes in the brain through these kind of feedback processes. And so, the way I would suggest that we think about this is an ancestral brain, and this would be the developmental trajectory that you would have seen in the chimp-human common ancestor. Of course, highly schematized. I don't just mean that there's 2 modules or 3 modules, right? But that here it would have looked like this, and that as we went along, we got increasing brain size. But in addition to increasing brain size, you have you may have increasing numbers of paralogous, perhaps, or at least homologous abilities that evolve in the same kind of way that I'm suggesting that the evolution of this visual word form area might be happening now. And again, accelerating as time goes on. And that if we think about the selection pressures that are happening, we have to think about this accelerating feedback from these changes in the brain on the, not only, it's easy to think about tool use, but the social environment is another important thing to think about. Group sizes were expanding. There's selection for increasingly sophisticated social cognition. That's going to involve a feedback loop between brain abilities and the social environment. Okay, so that's pointing out what I think elements of the explanation will need to be, which I think is substantially different than the landscape that you currently see of available possible explanations in the social sciences, which I think have this sort of, well, it's either innate, crystallized, specialized stuff that gets unpacked from a box and turned on, or it's domain general, totally domain general stuff. I think that the options, in fact, are don't represent, those options don't represent the true scope of possibilities. And I think that the problem is we want to arrive at the true account of what happened. And one thing that people say to me when this 2006 paper on modularity came out, which says, well, modularity is probably more, it's not as simple as you think it is. People said, well, but what was so great about Fodor's concept of modularity is it was so easy to apply. And that's true. In psychology, you can see cases, there's cases of studies where people have looked at, is it automatic or not? And the way that you measure that is, for example, putting people under cognitive load, having them keep 9 or 10 digits in mind while they're doing a task. And if that affects their performance on the task, then it's not automatic. Therefore, it's not a module. therefore it's not an evolved adaptation. That inference actually exists in the literature. And boy, wouldn't it be nice if that were, if we had that litmus test for saying, well, if it's an adaptation, make somebody keep 9 numbers in mind while they're doing it. And if that messes them up, then we know it's not an adaptation. That would be nice. That would be convenient, but unfortunately, it's not biologically realistic. It makes our job a lot harder. We'll have to use more converging lines of evidence. And I think that part of what this means is that we're going to have to be comparing possibilities that are on an equally plausible footing rather than sort of a null hypothesis style testing. So not crude parsimony. In biology, the simplest account is not, probably not usually the right one. So comparing plausibility. And I think the most important thing is being open to the possibilities of what, the complexities of what natural selection might have created in the brain, which are not likely to be simple at all. So thank you very much.